Good afternoon. Welcome to PeriScope, an effective probing and fuzzing network for the hardware OS boundary. We're in the Jasmine room. The speaker this afternoon is Dokyoung Song. And a couple of notes before we begin. Please stop by the business hall. It's located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline Ballrooms on level 2. You can stop by during the day, and then this evening there's the welcome reception at 5:30. Also, the Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2. Finally, join us for the Pony Awards in Lagoon JKL at 18:30. Just out of courtesy to your fellow attendees, please put your phone on vibrate. And if you have questions at the end of the session, there are microphones located on either side, so please use the microphones to ask any questions. And with that, I'd like to invite Dokyoung up to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm Dokyoung Song. I'm a PhD student at UC Irvine. I'm going to present our work, PeriScope, an effective probing and fuzzing framework for the hardware OS boundary. So this work is a joint work with my collaborators from UC Irvine, TU Berlin, UC Santa Barbara, and KU Leuven. So today, the security of peripheral devices remains questionable. As has been demonstrated by security researchers, peripheral chips such as Wi-Fi chips or baseband chips that expose an interface to the external world can be compromised over the air by just sending maliciously crafted package to the device. So all that was needed was proximity with the victim device that has its Wi-Fi or cellular network enabled. So let me give you a couple of examples here. So a prominent example of a peripheral attack is the Broadcom attack presented here at Black Hat 2 years ago. The attack demonstrated what they call is a fully remote exploit. Fully remote in the sense that they do not require any user interaction at all. So the vulnerability triggered and exploited here is in the association process of the Wi-Fi protocol that does not require any user interaction nor authentication. So with arbitrary code execution on the Wi-Fi chip, this specific attack demonstrated a worm attack that spreads across different devices nearby. And this slide shows a vulnerability that was used in a baseband exploit demonstrated at Mobile Pontoon. And it was demonstrated that this vulnerability allows arbitrary code execution. And arbitrary code execution was demonstrated by writing a file to a file system that the baseband chip had access to. So what these attacks have in common is that they compromise peripheral devices without coming to physical contact with the peripheral device. When you think about other peripheral attacks like USB attacks, they depend on the victim plugging in the malicious USB devices. People actually do plug them in, unfortunately, but still remote peripheral attacks are probably more dangerous because they are more stealthy. So with a peripheral compromise, how can the attacker compromise the operating system running on the main processor? After compromising peripheral device, the attacker is faced with what's called hardware OS interface. Just like OS kernels protect themselves from user space processes at the boundary of the system call interface, at this boundary of the hardware OS interface, they protect from peripheral devices that could potentially turn malicious. So among others, there are two mechanisms of implementing the hardware OS interface for the devices attached to the PCI bus: memory mapped I/O and direct memory access. So in memory mapped I/O, the device and the driver communicate with each other by writing to and reading from device memory. And in the case of direct memory access, the communication medium is memory pages in the main memory. So by compromising this hardware OS interface, the attacker can effectively turn a peripheral compromise into a full operating system compromise. So given the importance of this hardware OS interface, as well as the real threat posed by recent attacks, in our work, we aim to analyze the security of this hardware hardware OS interface operating under the following threat model. So we assume that the attacker has compromised the device and can write malicious values in both MMIO and DMA mappings. So our goal by analyzing this hardware OS interface is to discover vulnerabilities in the driver, in the kernel, which can be triggered and exploited by an attacker on a compromised device. Let me take a step back here a bit to provide you with a more complete and detailed picture of the OS kernel attack surface. So as we all know, besides the hardware OS boundary, there is a more conventional attack surface, which is the system call boundary. And speaking of Android these days, there are a diverse set of sandboxes deployed to narrow down the system call attack surface exposed to user space adversaries. For example, apps are strongly sandboxed via discretionary and mandatory access control. And potentially more dangerous code, such as JavaScript code, runs in a stronger sandbox. And most of IO kernel drivers are behind the hardware abstraction layer, and accesses to IO devices are mediated through the slightly more privileged user space daemons, which means that you need to first compromise those daemons to even start talking to an IO kernel driver. Hardware OS boundary, on the other hand, does have an isolation mechanism, IOMMU, and basically IOMMU limits the memory regions that can be accessed by a peripheral device to only those regions that are explicitly mapped by the operating system. But still, with IOMMU, a peripheral device basically still talks directly to the kernel driver with the running with the kernel privilege on the main processor, at least in the monolithic mainstream operating system kernels. And there are two ways to reach these OS kernel attack surfaces. First is through user space processes, and the second is through peripheral firmware. So how difficult would it be, given a memory error, to exploit, to compromise either user space processes or peripheral firmware? If you look at memory exploit mitigations deployed to protect user space processes and to protect peripheral firmware, the differences are quite significant. So in fact, one of the major enabling reasons for peripheral compromise is that peripheral devices are typically resource constrained and they lack basic memory exploit mitigation mechanisms such as data execution prevention or address space layout randomization. So peripheral firmware runs on microcontrollers, which often lack MMU or user mode, supervisor mode separation. For example, the Broadcom Wi-Fi chip that was targeted in the Broadpun attack, for example, had its entire RAM read-write executable. In contrast, user space programs in Android running on the capable ARM v8 main processor have all the commodity mitigation mechanisms turned on: control flow integrity, ASLR, DEP, and secure hardened heap allocator, and so on. So it makes sense for an attacker looking to compromise an operating system to turn to peripheral attack surface. So for these two attack surfaces to OS kernel, there are many analysis tools available already. Examples include syscaller, the popular kernel fuzzer that primarily targets the system call interface, which now has the USB fuzzing support. Here we add our tool PeriScope that can complement existing approaches that can analyze hardware OS interface. Now let me get back to our focus, hardware OS boundary, and explain in more detail what existing approaches are and how PeriScope can be useful in light of these existing approaches. So the first approach we find is a device adaptation approach that adapts or reprograms the device such that it can send arbitrary values to the driver and examines driver's response. While non-intrusive and can be OS independent, the effort is device specific, which needs to be duplicated for each and individual device, which does not scale given a large number of proprietary devices that are out there. It has limited visibility into the driver's behavior. The second approach we find is the dynamic approach. The second approach we find is a virtual machine-based approach where the analyst runs the entire system, including the device and the driver, on a virtualized environment. While virtual machine provides convenient mechanisms to interpose the execution of its guests, it requires either emulated device or hardware virtualization support. This can be problematic because in many cases, emulated device implementation is not available, and in some platforms, hypervisor level access is not exposed to end users, for example, in production smartphones. The third approach we find is a symbolic execution-based approach, which removes the need for devices altogether, and instead it replaces I/O mappings with symbolic, unconstrained symbolic variables. But it inherits though the downside of symbolic execution. It may not scale well to a real-world large device driver because of, for example, constraint solving costs. Our approach is an in-kernel dynamic approach, which does not require any change on the device side, nor does it require require the system to run in a virtualized environment. What it instead requires, because it's an in-kernel approach, is recompilation of the kernel. As long as the kernel can get recompiled and can be flashed, PeriScope can be useful in many existing testing environments, regardless of whether the underlying device is hardware virtualized, emulated, or running on bare metal. So based on the observation that both MMIO and DMA are memory-based communication, at least from the perspective of the main processor, we take a page fault-based monitoring approach to interpose the interactions between the device and the driver. This allows us to examine and potentially to influence the traffic between the device and the driver at a very fine grain granularity, basically at the level of individual memory accesses, all within the kernel. So here's the overview of how PeriScope works. First, when the device driver allocates either MMIO and DMA mappings, PeriScope marks these allocated pages as not present by modifying the corresponding page table entries in the page table. We do so by hooking into the kernel's MMIO and DMA allocation APIs. And when the device driver later accesses these MMIO and DMA mappings, page fault exceptions will be triggered and control flows into the kernel's page fault handler. We hook into this kernel page fault handler to call our page fault handler, in which we examine the fault and call user-registered hooks that can be implemented by the analyst for a wide variety of analysis purposes. And then PeriScope transfers the control back to the device driver to resume its normal execution. So on top of this framework, we designed and implemented PeriFuzz, a fuzzer that enables adversarial analysis of the hardware OS boundary. So the goal of PeriFuzz, as I mentioned, is to find vulnerabilities in the driver that can be triggered and potentially exploited by an attacker on a compromised device. So therefore, PeriFuzz fuzzes drivers' read accesses to MMIO and DMA mappings because the values being read by the device driver can be under the attacker's control under our threat model. To this end, PeriFuzz implements a custom hook that is registered with the PeriScope framework. So whenever a driver makes a read access to an I/O mapping, the hook requests fuzzing that read access that's being made. So the injector component of PeriFuzz receives an input generated by the fuzzer running in user space, and it injects the fuzzer supplied value to the destination register of defaulting instruction. And it resumes driver's execution from the instruction that immediately follows defaulting instruction, because now the defaulting instruction has now been emulated or fuzzed. So the same procedure repeats for each driver's read access until the injected value leads to any observable error, such as segmentation fault. Before explaining our fuzzing in more detail, let me quickly review our threat model in more detail. Since peripheral devices and device drivers on the main processor each runs on a separate processor operating on their own clock, the attacker can not only write any value to the I/O mapping, but also at any time, even multiple times, and potentially in between drivers' read accesses. So this adversarial capability creates a possibility of double fetch bugs in drivers handling I/O mappings. So double fetch bugs are a class of time of check to time of use race conditions. And let me give you a concrete example of a double fetch bug here. So on the right-hand side of the slide, the driver is about to fetch 2 bytes from an I/O mapping and checks if the fetched value is less than FF. Because the fetched value is indeed less than FF, the check passes and the control flows into the basic block that's protected by the check. And at this point, the peripheral device makes a malicious update of the same exact bytes that were just fetched by the driver, and then the driver fetches the same 2 bytes again. At this point, the fact that the driver has passed this if condition check is no longer valid, and subsequent uses of this value might cause the driver to perform an unintended or potentially exploitable operations, such as buffer overflow in this example. So with this in mind, we designed the following fuzzer input consumption model. So the idea is that to sequentially consume the bytes in the fuzzer generated input to provide different value to each fetch, regardless of whether it is overlapping with any of the previous fetches or not. So let me give you an example. Given a fuzzer generated input, the driver fetches 2 bytes from an I/O mapping, and perifuzz consumes the first 2 available bytes from the fuzzer generated input. And if there is an overlapping fetch, perifuzz consumes the next 2 available bytes in the fuzzer generated input. Non-overlapping fetches, of course, also consumes the next 2 available bytes in the fuzzer generated input. So to explain how all of this fits into a bigger picture and eventually form a fuzzing loop, let me quickly explain how device interrupts are typically handled in operating system kernels. So the Linux kernel's page interrupt handling can be subdivided into top half and bottom half handling of interrupts. The top half interrupt handler mostly just acknowledges the interrupt and queues up the data associated with that interrupt to be later processed by the device driver. Because most of the work is done by bottom half handlers, we aligned each iteration of the fuzzing loop to one of the bottom half handler mechanisms called software interrupt handler, or soft IRQ. So at various points in time that the kernel finds it convenient, the kernel calls one of the bottom half handlers registered by the device driver. A single execution of a software interrupt handler corresponds to a single iteration of the fuzzing loop, and in each iteration, the bytes in a single fuzzer generated input are consecutively consumed according to our fuzzer input consumption model. So to do so, we hook the entrance and the exit of the software interrupt handler, and we switch the fuzzer input after each exit of software interrupt handler. And we based our prototype implementation on Linux kernel version 4.4 for ARM v8 architecture, which we ported to Linux kernel version 3.10, and we used AFL as our fuzzing front end. In our experiment, we targeted 2 Wi-Fi drivers running inside 2 popular smartphones. The Qualcomm Wi-Fi driver running in Google Pixel 2 and the Broadcom Wi-Fi driver running in Samsung's Galaxy S6. Let me quickly highlight some of the characteristics of these targets to explain the challenges that these targets pose on any analysis efforts. First of all, these drivers are one of the largest in terms of the number of source lines of code. both drivers consist of more than hundreds of thousands of lines of code, which is beyond manual, beyond the effort of beyond the manual effort. And they're also highly concurrent, making heavy use of kernel threads and bottom-up interrupt handlers to maximize the concurrency and responsiveness of the system. And lots of code run in an interrupt context or kernel thread context, which means that existing system call fuzzers may not be used to directly reach those basic blocks. Also, no emulated device implementation is available to our knowledge, and the production smartphones do not expose the EL2 privilege level to users, so hypervisor-based approach cannot be easily applied at least. These are the results. In total, by applying our tools, we found 15 vulnerabilities, 9 of which were previously unknown, and 8 new CVEs were assigned. We found not just most common types of vulnerabilities, like buffer overreads or overwrites, but also double fetch issues, and also kernel address disclosure to the peripheral device. Let me discuss these 3 bugs in the next slides. So let me start with this simple buffer overflow found in the Qualcomm Wi-Fi driver. So the problem here was that the driver used a value read from an I/O mapping as an index into an array without validating the size of the buffer, which is now patched by adding a validation check before the use of index. And let me describe the double fetch issue we found in the Broadcom Wi-Fi driver. So the double fetch bug started with the driver initially fetching a message from an I/O mapping for an integrity check that verifies the checksum of the entire message. Only if the message passed this integrity check, the driver starts to process the message. Unfortunately, the driver performs an overlapping fetch from the I/O mapping, at which point the integrity of the message can no longer be guaranteed. When this value was being read by the device driver from the I/O mapping, our fuzzer fuzzed the value, and the fuzz value was used as an index into an array, leading the system to crash. Let me also describe the kernel address leak or disclosure we found. So the symptom of this bug, as we encountered, was a kernel crash caused by directly dereferencing a value provided our fuzzer as a pointer. After our investigation, we found that a kernel pointer was being disclosed in the first place to the peripheral device in the name of cookie. The device internally uses these cookie values and writes them back to another I/O mapping, which is subsequently read and dereferenced by the kernel driver. So our fuzzer fuzzed the cookie value when the driver was reading the value from the I/O mapping and led the kernel to crash. So this vulnerability could have been used by an attacker to bypass K-ASLR. So this is the performance of our fuzzer. So the fuzzing throughput ranged about 7 to 24 inputs per second, depending on the nature of the I/O mapping we fuzzed. And it primarily depends on the number of page faults triggered in each iteration. For example, 50 page faults per iteration gives at around 20 inputs per second. Although it cannot be directly be compared, we also ran syscaller on the same device on Pixel 2, and we found that it achieved about, on average, 24 programs executions per second with a maximum around 60. With that, I'd like to conclude with 3 key takeaways. So kernel drivers are vulnerable, as evidenced by the number of vulnerabilities we found in our fuzzing campaign. So combined with remote peripheral compromise, it poses serious threat to OS kernel security. And vulnerabilities that occur along the hardware OS boundary can be subtle, not just memory corruption vulnerabilities, but also other kernel address disclosure or leak and double fetch issues. And our tools can be effective at exposing and finding these vulnerabilities along the hardware OS boundary. The content of the talk was based on a paper published earlier this year at NDSS. So if you're interested, you can have a look. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So for the Wi-Fi bugs, were you really speaking the protocol or just fuzzing locally, like could be remotely exploitable?
Yeah, it was not actually related to the Wi-Fi protocol, but more of a proprietary implementation between the interaction between the device and the driver, like low-level management of buffers, ring buffers, those sort of things. Thank you.